Thanks for inviting me. And let me just say what a pleasure it is to join you. I commend the Debt Foundation and your Debt Commission for your efforts in drawing attention to this critical issue. And I think especially in seeking bipartisan solutions. I'm particularly pleased, I don't know if he's on yet, but I know that Congressman Panetta will be joining you at some point during this time as well. His father and I were actual seatmates on the House Agriculture Committee 40 years ago, and we've been really good friends ever since. But I think before we get into a discussion, let me just make 3 points. First, in this era of deep political polarization, our growing national debt must be an urgent priority, not only of conservatives, but I think of progressives as well. Both Republicans and Democrats have a lot at stake here. As members of the foundation and commission, I know each of you have become real students of the debt, and you're all too familiar with our current circumstances. But what concerns me as a progressive Democrat is the fact that our deficit this year will actually exceed $4 trillion, which is quadruple what it was just last year. And our new debt will now exceed the size of the entire economy, eclipsing the record set right after World War II. So it poses an increasingly grave threat to our national economic health, but I think to our very survival as a democratic republic in the long term. And I'd emphasize that I think you alluded to it. I believe that the borrowing this year was absolutely necessary for both health and economic reasons. But just as both parties demonstrated fiscal responsibility after World War II, and you have to give them great credit for the leadership they showed and the courage and commitment they made. I guess I'd have to acknowledge, regrettably, that all last week and so far this week, neither party has even mentioned debt as a priority or as an issue of national concern. So that's the first point. This really ought to be a bipartisan issue. The second point I'd make is that success here really isn't rocket science. I was the Senate Democratic leader during the time we negotiated the Balanced Budget Act of 1997. Leon, at that time, of course, was the chief of staff, and it was a tumultuous time. You're mostly all too young to remember this, but there were 2 government shutdowns, one over the Christmas holidays. But day after day, the principals literally, and I mean literally, spent day and night sitting in the Oval Office, off and on for nearly 3 weeks, negotiating some sort of a compromise here. And it really made a difference that we were in the Oval Office. We actually had a coin flip many days to decide which party would present their proposals first in the meeting. But it was contentious, it was deeply exhausting, it was emotional. But in the end, we actually reached agreement. We balanced the budget for the next 4 years. And I don't want to say that that was the only reason, but due in part to that work and economic growth and the actions taken earlier in the decade. But the lesson learned here is that it required both leaders of both parties, of both branches of government, first to make it a national priority, and then second to be personally involved in finding a solution. So that's the second point. The third point and final point that I'd make, and I really believe this, and I probably say it too often, but you're a new crowd, so I can say it to you for the first time. Compromise is the oxygen of democracy, and I really emphasize that. I believe it to my bone. Compromise is the oxygen of democracy. In today's world, that means 2 things. First, everything has to be on the table. Both cuts in spending and increases in revenue are absolutely essential. That means reducing entitlement spending, and yes, it means increasing taxes. And secondly, to reach compromise, you have to be willing, and this is tough, you have to be willing to challenge your most diehard supporters. These days, when base politics is so prevalent, with members on both sides worried about getting a primary, that it is very difficult to challenge your best and most diehard supporters. It's even harder with social media and constant hyperbolic cable news. But the key for negotiators, And this is probably true, and each of you have probably had this experience in different contexts. But in almost any situation, it's especially true to climb into the shoes of the other parties at the table and understand what motivates them personally, politically, and professionally. So let me just say again, I applaud your leadership and the efforts of the foundation and commission. I oftentimes quote Nelson Mandela in situations like this. He once said something that I think is probably fairly relevant. He once said, many things seem impossible until they're done. Well, this may seem impossible, but with courage and real leadership, I think it too can be done. So I'll stop with that and we can open it up to discussion.